Good evening. Hello. My name is Hugh Pocock. I'm faculty here. I'm also the coordinator of the concentration in sustainability and social practice. And welcome, and thank you all for attending tonight's lecture. We're very, very fortunate to have TJ Demos with us tonight. I've admired TJ's work for a long time. I'm very glad to have him here.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak. It's a great pleasure to be back at MICA, where I still have really very warm memories of being here and teaching in Baltimore and at MICA. So thanks very much, Hugh, again for the invitation, and thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to, as Hugh indicated, I'm going to talk about this project, which is an analysis of art and ecology at Documenta 13, which is the last Documenta in 2012. And this is in the context of a current book project that I'm working on which will deal with contemporary art and ecology. So I'd like to actually give you a very quick overview of my book project and what it looks at and what the different aspects of it are very quickly, and then turn to Documenta 13. So as Hugh mentioned, I edited this journal in last year. Third Text. It was a special issue on contemporary art and the politics of ecology. And in part, that's where my work is coming out of, meaning an attempt to look at how artists are engaging with the environment in a global context. The cover image is by a Nigerian photographer, George Osodi, and this is an image of gas flares in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where there's a lot of oil interest and also a lot of very violent and long-standing social conflict around oil extraction and the social conditions and environmental conditions that exist there. So the book, which is provisionally titled The Post-Natural Condition, Contemporary Art and Political Ecology, it looks at how a variety of models of visual culture, artistic and activist practices approach multiple conflicts around contemporary ecology, including, for example, global warming and climate change, resource extraction, overconsumption, and industrial pollution. As in the context of, as I just mentioned, oil drilling and the Ogoni resistance in Nigeria's Niger Delta, as depicted in the work of the Nigerian photographer George Osodi, also the cover of the Third Text issue. Or, for example, in Ghana, and this is an image of the e-waste dump site, one of the many dump sites for electronic waste that exists in that country, and the informal recycling industry, as portrayed in the South African photographer Peter Hugo. One overarching concern of the book project is to investigate how environmental impacts are geographically differentiated according to economic inequality and legacies of colonialism, which is transformed into contemporary neoliberal capitalism. And more, how people living in areas of environmental violence are mobilizing visual strategies of critical analysis and also resistance. In this sense, the book attempts to overcome the limitations of what some, such as the Indian critic and environmentalist Ramachandra Guha, have termed the ecology of affluence. The ecology of affluence designates a kind of environmentalism that's largely contained in the developed world, or the developed West, in quotations, that historically has had, that is, this type of environmentalism has had very little interest in social justice and the environmentalism of the poor in the global South and East. As we know, fossil fuel capitalism and modern industrial development have created the conditions of global warming leading to the melting of ice in the Earth's polar regions. Investigating the geological effects on native life is one goal of the Indian photographer and activist Shubhankar Banerjee, whose work in the Arctic forms a second geographical and thematic focus of my study. Here I'm interested in how Banerjee's work on the far north environment circulates not only in art galleries, but also online in activist campaigns and governmental debates, and is reported in the mainstream media, forming part of the struggle to prevent drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And this is, I'm showing you just two images here that show you this. This is his image of a polar bear, kind of in some ways a typical image of a charismatic animal that is capable of generating support for wildlife and protecting areas of nature. And that image was adopted by Barbara Boxer in a congressional debate in 2002, which helped to stop George W. Bush's attempt to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling. So it's a fascinating case of a context where an artwork actually can have extremely important political effects within governmental politics, which is quite unusual, but it's a really interesting example of how art, in fact, can have a huge amount of social and political impact. So how has this expanded image complex contributed to the momentum around eco-activism, lending its visual sensibilities to the movement for indigenous rights, for northern resource sovereignty, for the rights of non-human agents, which are among the objectives of Banerjee's aesthetic politics. And these are the kind of questions that I'm asking in that chapter. With the melting of ice, of course, comes sea level rise and a further debate around the politics of climate refugees. While NGO-related groups like the Argos Collective, the top image is by that group, the Argos Collective, from France. They picture low-lying island nation-states like the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, at risk from submersion. Their struggle on behalf of so-called climate refugees has been criticized as a form of, people use this term, wishful sinking, because it all too quickly accepts the narrative of sea level rise in a it may be well-intentioned, but a kind of fatalistic manner. And you can tell the way there's a lot more to be said here. It's very kind of a quick introduction, but if you just look at how they're picturing the Maldives from half underwater, you can see a visual example of this phenomenon of wishful sinking. So here I compared a climate refugee discourse to the position of the Maldivians themselves, who reject the refugee identity in favor of the agency of mounting political resistance to the industrial causes of environmental change. At one point holding an underwater cabinet meeting led by the progressive president Mohammed Nasheed to dramatize the imminent threat to their existence through a form of political theater, which is, I think, quite innovative in terms of its aesthetic strategies. And so there you see President Nasheed signing a document to make the Maldives carbon neutral within 20 years. The situation of the Maldives raises the question of what options do people have to manifold environmental threats, rather than simply accepting climate change as an unstoppable given, especially among those who are most susceptible to its negative effects, owing to conditions of impoverishment or weak or oppressive state infrastructure or lack of technological resources. So in another chapter, I look south to Mexico and examine experimental artistic positions that respond to the forces of big agribusiness and GM biotechnology and the financialization of nature that's occurring there, as well as to social movements such as the Zapatistas, which have rejected NAFTA's disastrous ecology in favor of political autonomy and economic self-sufficiency and environmental sustainability, merging their revolutionary anti-imperialism with indigenous rights and the cultivation of agroecological biodiversity, expressed through a specific Mexican politics of aesthetics. And here you have a range of painting and photographs and collective gardening practices that all come out of the Zapatista context in Chiapas. I also investigate how movements like the Zapatistas relate to international indigenous peoples' struggles, such as the formation of the group that's called Idle No More in Canada, and the Cochabamba Rights of Mother Earth movement that have grown in recent years. So this is something that's quite new, at least in my work, but I think it's fascinating and really hugely important when it comes to ecology and the politics of environmentalism. That is, indigenous approaches to nature. It represents a huge resource. So how do we deal with that in artistic and cultural terms? Similar conflicts have been brewing in the Indian subcontinent, and especially in the state of Orissa, which is in East India, where mining interests in valuable minerals have displaced tribal villagers and indigenous people, leading to a conflict between armed Maoist insurgents and a militarized Indian police state, which is the subject of independent films like Sanjay Kak's Red Ant Dream, as you see a publicity image of there. As well, artists like Amar Kanwar have investigated the recent turn to traditional chemical-free farming as a third way, whereby Indians attempt to reclaim sovereignty, rejecting the state's support of corporate globalization and its export-driven, seed-patented, monoculture model of agribusiness. My interest here is less in the gallery-bound presentations of Kanwar's films and more in his grassroots activities in Orissa, where he works as part of a collective to foster independent media filmmaking and political analysis that works toward nonviolent democratic resolutions. Finally, I mean, there's still more, but finally, in terms of this brief introduction, I address experimental artistic and more broadly cultural practices that offer critical analyses of current approaches to nature. For instance, that of a monetized natural capital, where nature is defined in economic terms. And this is enormous. This is a really big development recently that's supported by most governments and transnational organizations like the UN and World Bank. Which is, this whole phenomenon is investigated by many artists, among them the San Francisco-based artist Amy Balkin, whose work you see on the top there. As well, I'm interested in exploring not only the failings of green capitalism, but also the positive transformative possibilities of alternative modes of practice, such as the community-based permaculture gardening artistic model of someone like Nils Norman, as developed in his recent work in The Hague. So that's a still of a permaculture garden that he's been involved with there. In partnership with local participants and gardeners and political activists struggling for non-capitalist and low-impact forms of social and agricultural organization. And that is obviously a connection to the kind of urban gardening that's been happening in the States, and particularly in places like Detroit and Baltimore. So it's really, I've been doing a tour with Hugh today on the various urban gardens that exist in Baltimore. It's really, I think it's really incredible and really inspirational. So as you can see, even from this very brief overview, the book project is quite expansive in geographical terms, maybe even overwhelming, I have to say, as it attempts to give a picture of global conflicts over resource extraction, land use, climate change discourse, and social justice. It also considers a wide field of visual culture, centering on practitioners who intervene in the politics of aesthetics as an expanded arena of visual culture, falling within and between the boundaries of art, for example, experimental filmmaking, photojournalism, governmental forms of appearance, NGO discourse, and mainstream corporate and independent media. So in that sense, it's very attentive. It attempts to be attentive to a widened sphere of aesthetic modes of political appearance. It also looks at diverse institutional sites, like public spaces, galleries, media websites, as well as multiple interdisciplinary connections between fields like art, speculative philosophy, climate science, earth law, social justice, and postcolonial theory. So I'm at work on this right now, and I'm finding actually that it's much more complex than I originally mapped out in terms of a project. I think it can't possibly even be a single book. If I end up writing a book on this, it will be only an introduction to future projects. So with that said, I'll move on to my presentation on Documenta 13. This will be a presentation. I think it'll be okay if you haven't seen it, because it'll show you a lot of images and talk about what the show offered in terms of a really interesting engagement between art and ecology. So according to Carolyn Christoph-Bakarjiev, who is the director of Documenta 13 in 2012, she wrote, "We live in a state of permanent crisis, a state of emergency, and thus of exception. Calling to mind images of endless war, for example, in the Middle East, the recognition would seem to set the stage for an engaged curatorial presentation of agitprop political art. Thus it was surprising that she chose to respond to that state of crisis with numerous gardens in what is undoubtedly the most ambitious of mega exhibitions, and that's worldwide. Nonetheless, the show was overgrown with experimental planters and creatively landscaped areas, relating variously to agriculture, farming, and natural life forms, which made the 2012 iteration of Documenta, which occurs every 5 years in Germany, the most green yet. The various models of garden as art included Christina Buch's The Lover, which is what you've been looking at here. Here are a couple other views of this installation, which was an open-air butterfly microhabitat installed in front of Kassel's Stadttheater, comprised of plants ideal for the indigenous varieties of the insect, some of which emerged from their chrysalises during the length of the show. The show is traditionally 100 days long. Also, the Swiss artist Christian Philipp Müller did this piece called Swiss Chard Ferry. A group of barges floating on one of the canals in the Karlsruhe Park, filled with different edible varieties, which was realized in cooperation with the Department of Organic Agricultural Sciences at the University of Kassel, which is interesting, and it's an interesting example of an artist working with a natural sciences department at the university. Then there was Song Dong's Doing Nothing Garden, as it was called, a 6-meter-high accumulation of rubble and organic waste, sprouting grass and flowers and sporting neon signs reading "doing" and "nothing" in Chinese, which was found on the Karlswiese lawn in front of the Orangerie, another one of the main venues at Documenta 13. So to some, gardens may seem irrelevant to our world of crises and emergencies, the specific circumstances of which the director, Carolyn Christoph-Bakarjiev, neglected to identify. But in fact, they concern the most urgent of global conflicts, including, for example, the financialization of nature, realized by the patenting of genetically modified seeds by multinational agricultural and pharmaceutical corporations, the production of greenhouse gas emissions via monocultural and export-based farming reliant on chemical fertilizers and the fossil fuel transportation industry. These are just a variety of images that show the global conflict over what really comes down to farming practices in agriculture, agribusiness, and food production, as well as the destruction of unions and small-scale subsistence farmers, displaced by the by the mechanized production of transnational agribusiness. So about these various pressing crises and emergencies, the curator ultimately had nothing to say. That is in their catalog essays and public announcements. And as such, the various biotic artworks risked becoming mere green embellishments to an already organically adorned Baroque environment, especially given the Karl Sauer's Park's 18th century redesign as a landscape garden. So here you see a view of that park. For instance, Claire Pentecost, she's a Chicago-based artist who works a lot with ecology. Her vertical gardens adorned the Athenaeum's front grounds, rendering her 8-foot-high dirt and plant towers extensions of the Natural History Museum's landscaping, and suggesting an organic approach to sculptural decoration, if you didn't know what her work was about. Yet far from evident was the radical nature of her proposals, which these vertical gardens are meant as prototypes for self-sufficient food production in land-poor urban areas, as well as conceptual proposals for the detachment of soil from real estate. So described somewhat cunningly as an exhibition without a concept by the director in the run-up to the show. And she did that in order to, at least as far as she explained, to emphasize the singularity of the artistic inclusions in the exhibition. She didn't want to subject the artwork in the show to her curatorial conceptualization. So described in this way, Documenta 13 largely outsourced the definition of the show's conceptualization to its in some ways impossibly multiple and sometimes internally conflicted 100 notebooks, the publications of the exhibition. So here you see an array of some of those notebooks. While that overwhelming panoply provided little immediate service to visitors at the exhibition, the publications do open up fertile territory for consideration of the pressing environmental matters raised in the exhibition. The series assembles short essays. You can see they're very small books, except for the large volume, which is the book of all the 100 books that you see on the top and bottom there. So it assembles short essays by a range of artists and theorists, including some of the ecological, such as Donna Haraway and Vandana Shiva, so an American theorist who deals with a lot with technology and science fiction, famous for her work on Cyborg, and Vandana Shiva, an Indian environmental activist and scientist. And these notebooks suggest numerous productive, if competing, ways to approach the exhibition's gardens, and more broadly, the artistic inclusions within and their approach to the environment. So I'd like to talk about two in particular and give you a sense of different ways to approach the ecology of art within the exhibition. So let's start with Donna Haraway's book, which is called SF, Speculative Fabulation and String Figures. The book develops the terms of an aesthetic of techno-organic hybridity, which is familiar in Haraway's well-known work on cyborgs, and finds, for Haraway, a creative political inspiration in the science of gene research and bioengineering. SF for Haraway extends to such meanings as speculative fabulation, speculative feminism, science fiction, science fact, and science fantasy, each exemplifying the joining of otherwise conventional oppositions that her cyborg also signifies as she writes, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction, one modeling and stimulating a world beyond the oppressive binaries of Western modernity, such as male, female, culture, nature, subject, object, technology, biology. So the cyborg breaks down all of these oppositions. Haraway's conceptual presence was discernible in the exhibition's spatial dispersion. Here's a map of the different installations in the spread of, largely in the park, the Karlsruhe Park that you see here. So you have to see the exhibition took multiple days, at least 4 days, to see all of these sites and walk around and spend time with the work on display. So there were dozens of off-site locations comprising a rhizomatic display geography. And it was also, Haraway's presence was also perceptible in the show's conceptual diffusion, where 100 approaches eclipsed any single reigning theme. In fact, Haraway was one of the key advisors to the director. It's also noteworthy Haraway's presence in the so-called nature culture, within one word, nature culture, and what she calls intra-actional aspects of the becoming with ontology of the gardens. These are all Haraway-inspired terms, suggesting hybrid mediums that play a role in both organizing and providing socio-aesthetic support systems for human life, which is a theoretical framework that significantly opens up the conceptual possibility of artists' work with gardens. And that's a key aspect, I think, for considering gardens as art, that, the kind of conceptual, social, and political dimensions that, that work with natural materials makes apparent and advances in really interesting creative ways. Yet, mobilizing Haraway as a model for eco-aesthetics proved tricky in this context, especially when placed in relation to the many explicitly political garden practices in the exhibitions, such as the one of Irina Nastas and René Gabri and their collective called And, which embraced, in their words, an anti-capitalist, organic, and localist character, and whose garden kiosks sold regional produce and food on the exhibition grounds during the length of the show. The artist-run initiative formed part of Documenta 13's research team, and they investigated notions of the commons and non-capitalist life in gatherings and seminars across the world, from the US Social Forum in Detroit to workshops in Tunis, Yerevan, and Buenos Aires during the 2-year period of the exhibition's preparation. The group also organized events over the show's 100 days, such as event number 13, in alliance with the group called the Compass of the Midwest Radical Culture Corridor, where they placed the Monsanto Corporation on trial for ecological and economic crimes in Carbondale in Chicago, Illinois, and also Iowa City in 2012. So Monsanto is one of the corporations that is most infamous and responsible for genetically modified seeds, and also for patenting seeds and making it necessary for farmers to buy seeds on a yearly basis. So it's had a particularly negative effect on farming and small-scale farmers globally. So the political ecology, so here, this is just a quick image of the advertisement for the Monsanto hearings, and a still from the video that's available online, so you can actually watch the trial of Monsanto, which invites people from the community in these areas, like from farming communities, to come and talk about their experiences farming and what Monsanto has meant to them, and how it's had such a disastrous impact on their lives. So the political ecology here, implied here, is perhaps better articulated, instead of Haraway, it's better articulated by the Indian eco-activist Vandana Shiva, another of the exhibition's notebook authors. And Shiva is known for her struggle against the patenting of indigenous knowledge of seeds and plant life in India by multinational pharmaceutical and agribusiness corporations exactly like Monsanto. While Haraway also explicitly opposes the patenting of life forms. Her postmodern aesthetic of techno-feminist sci-fi ultimately crosses Shiva's anti-corporate globalization climate justice activism, leading to a conflict of ecological positions that I think is worthy of further discussion. For Vandana Shiva, writing a notebook much less playful than Haraway's, entitled The Corporate Control of Life, she writes, "Living organisms, unlike machines, organize themselves and cannot be treated as simply biotechnological inventions or gene constructs or products of the mind." That is, in these ways, if you can argue that a gene construct is a product of the human mind, then that gives you the ability to patent it and claim it as basically your intellectual property. So Shiva is arguing that that's impossible, that life itself, life processes cannot be patented or owned by corporations. It's a huge political force that she represents in that sense. So against which she indicts as corporate biopiracy, Shiva places her emphasis on the fight to protect the legal sovereignty of non-commercializable knowledge systems and the free and universal access to the life processes that comprise humanity's shared heritage. Haraway's cyborg, conversely, in Haraway's words, does not dream of community on the model of the organic family and would not recognize the Garden of Eden, as she or he is wary of holism but needy for connection. For Haraway, again quoting her, "The lively area of transgenic research worldwide, giving rise to such hybrids as the tomato with a gene from the cold sea bottom living flounder, which codes for a protein that slows freezing. So these hybrids inspire visions of new forms of emancipation from essentialist identities and cultural ontological purities." So these are just a couple images of such a tomato, a transgenic tomato. The one on the left is from Critical Art Ensemble, which has done a lot of work critical of this kind of biotechnology. Haraway, moreover, has acknowledged being suspicious of activist positions that oppose corporate science with the values of the local and the organic. She writes, "I cannot help but hear in the biotechnology debates the unintended tones of fear of the alien and suspicion of the mixed. In the appeal to intrinsic natures, I hear mystification of kind and purity akin to the doctrines of white racial hegemony and U.S. national integrity and purpose." So that's Donna Haraway. I think that's a remarkable claim. In other words, to be suspicious of people who are opposing corporate biotechnology and GM technology, to say that those people are like white racists is just absolutely remarkable. Even though there's a ton of complexity in that quote, because there is a history of environmentalism, for example, that has supported discourses of purity, like to protect certain areas of national parks, and to do so by kicking indigenous people, like Native Americans, off the land. So there is a history of this kind of relationship, but it's really changed, I think, in contemporary times. So that quote is extremely, I think, alarming. Okay, so yet, with Shiva's politics in mind, one cannot help but hear in Haraway's optimism for GMOs, that is a questionable aesthetico-political imagination that unintentionally, perhaps, corresponds with corporate practices like Monsanto's and its global threat to the livelihood of farmers and biodiversity, indigenous eco-knowledge, and human health itself. So, sorry if that was very quick, but there's a huge debate there, and it's really, I think, significant and could be talked a lot about more. So there was thus a profound divergence within Documenta 13's discursive positioning of its gardens between Haraway's postmodern constructivist approach to biotechnological hybridity as a model of creative liberation on the one hand, and Vandana Shiva's post-colonial commitment to an ecological justice opposed to corporate property claims on organic resources pilfered from the third world on the other. So while Documenta 13 productively raised this very conundrum by its inclusion of these voices in their notebook publications, and you have to give them credit for that, the clash of positions which concerns, as I'm arguing, pressing global conflicts over food production, the capitalist economy, and the status of the natural world, these conflicts they were never explicitly engaged in the exhibition's framework, only by individual artists and writers. As a result, Carolyn Christoph Bakardziev's project, Documenta 13, risked a non-position of uncommitted pluralism, which I think is a tendency familiar in the generally liberal milieu of contemporary art today, which is happy to make allusions to crises and emergencies, but take no clear stand in relation to them, at least no political stand in relation to them. For instance, there was no better place to address this debate than when Documenta held a conference called On Seeds and Multi-Species Intra-Action, Disowning Life, which was described as a 2-day public conference taking as its starting point, in the words of the publicity statement, Documenta 13's ecological perspective, building on a global alliance between different forms of research and knowledge that is actively being developed in a variety of fields. Yet while both Vandana Shiva and Donna Haraway participated as speakers in this event, there was no discussion between them or public consideration of the larger stakes between their positions. To take a position, this is a critique of the curatorial methodology behind the exhibition in this sense. So to take a position would demand a critique of the political economy of sci-fi aesthetics, of the kind that Haraway supports, and to position that critique in relation to social justice activism of the kind that Shiva points out. The point isn't to dismiss these garden practices, but only to critically consider and problematize their discursive positioning by considering the intersection of art and ecology at this crucial historical moment in exhibition making. For the gardens, like Christina Buch's butterfly habitat, offer an intriguing aesthetic imaginary of being together in ways that displace the human subject from a position of masterful sovereignty, which in many ways resonates with Haraway's work on companion species and post-anthropocentric sociability. In other words, for an artist to design this and then allow the butterflies themselves to create the work is an interesting transmission of artistic agency to the non-human world. Similarly, Christian Philip Mueller's Swiss chard fairy offers a way of conceiving an experimental interdisciplinarity between art and organic agroecology, corresponding in many ways to Shiva's support for chemical-free sharing of seeds and the strengthening of a trans-institutional ecological commons. So the problem then is that the curatorial discourse of Documenta tended to displace crucial questions of political and economic differences, for example, between first world speculative fabulation and third world environmental justice, instead opting for a conflict-free aestheticization of nature without a clear sense of the important stakes of these theoretical positions. Yet even when the curators neglected to systematically address these conflicts, some artists in the exhibition posed such questions in their work, asking for example, how do futurist imaginings of corporate biotech experimentation correlate with current-day political conflicts over land use, energy resources, and GM technology? And what's the political and unconscious implied in post-apocalyptic aesthetics? Just an aside here, I think it's interesting that most often, as far as I've discovered in my research, it's artists who are in many ways leading the way in terms of creatively addressing these kind of ecological conditions. So in fact, Documenta 13 included numerous artistic visions of potential dystopian futures, which occupy the dark side of eco-catastrophe and ecocide, which the exhibition's experimental gardens were so intent on forestalling. So I'd like to consider them briefly as well, at least two examples of this dark side of ecology that was present in Documenta 13. So consider News from Nowhere by the South Korean artists Moon Kyun-won and Jun Jun-ho. An example of sci-fi aesthetics, the multimedia project comprises a film and an installation. You see a shot of the double screen film as it was displayed in the exhibition. Here's a shot of the installation. And also a research publication. So actually quite ambitious project. And it builds on a scientific iconography of genetic engineering and biotechnology that resonates in many ways with Haraway's cyborg poetic eco-futurism. In this regard, it reveals further ways to consider the relations between science, ecology, and advanced capitalism in contemporary art at Documenta 13. Inspired by the eponymous 1890 story of a future agrarian worker society by the socialist artist William Morris. And here's a shot of his book, News from Nowhere, the first edition, that gives you his amazing arts and crafts impression, the rendering of the story. So inspired by this book, Moon and Jun's News from Nowhere visualizes an apocalyptic time to come. Here, these are two stills from the film. When humanity, according to the scenario of the project, when humanity, owing to a series of unspecified major climate changes, is reduced to an endangered species living in a biologically hostile environment, and survivors are left to reconsider their philosophies of life now that the earth lies in ruins. Referencing utopian socialism of William Morris and science fiction alike, the installation's subject is set in a late 21st century Earth permeated with radioactivity and hazardous waste, where the fictional corporate giant Tempers rules over all. Those seeking citizenship, including the central film's male and female protagonists, volunteer to collect samples of the exterior Earth without realizing that their real mission is to serve as living research specimens exposed to atmospheric conditions, atmospheric contamination. The archival installation that goes along with the project assembles an array of futuristic products, such as clothes and tools, that created collaboratively with other artists, designers, and architects, are presented as if they come from the film's fictional corporation. And the film, so this is a variety of the products that you see in the book and also in the installation. And the film, entitled The End of the World, shows the main characters in their laboratory cataloging and examining specimens from the outside world as they meditate on their own existential situation. So I'll play a brief clip of this. It's about a minute long. You might not be able to read the subtitles, but I'll explain what she's saying afterwards.
자연물과 다른 성분이 구성되었으며 일정한 경계에 돌무와 같은 딱딱하고 투명한 성분의 구성체와 줄기 같은 유연한 재질로 연결되어 있어 추과학적 데이터를 분석시키는 데
basically examining Christmas tree lights that they've discovered in the outside world and performing a kind of scientific analysis on that specimen. So the project makes apparent, at least in my view, a further risk of this kind of sci-fi poetics that aestheticizes crisis, which is that it establishes very little political traction in the present. Much like the speculative fabulation of pop cultural variants, films like Avatar or Oblivion, the piece sidesteps critical contemporary environmental knowledge, opting more for visual gratifications of our desire for futurist fantasy. Indeed, it pays mere lip service to the failures of the present without identifying the causes of, or even better, providing alternatives to the major climate changes that serve as the fiction's generic foundation. So they don't define what such a major climate change would be. In other words, seduced by futuristic style and a corporate scientist's social order, technological redemption, and the imagery of the transfigured post-human cyborg body, the film and installation construct a problematic utopian imaginary within our otherwise catastrophic circumstances. That's a very quick criticism, but I'm just trying to have limited time, so I can only get into it briefly. A countermodel is, I think, offered by the Audilith Group. They're a London-based collective, and their film specifically, which is called The Radiant from 2012. You see a couple stills up here, which exchanges Moon and Jun's dystopian futurism for a focus on the real existing corporate science complex and its disastrous failure that is itself worthy of fiction. The approximately 1 hour long film takes March 11, 2011 as its point of departure. That is when the Tohoku earthquake occurred off the Pacific coast of Japan, triggering a tsunami that left more than roughly 20,000 people dead and caused a catastrophic nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, which continues to contaminate land, air, and maritime environments to this day. So this is an ongoing, huge environmental calamity. Mixing appropriated historical media footage and live videotapes of interviews with scientists, activists, and locals, the film joins the erstwhile promise of nuclear energy expressed during the plant's post-war construction to the future threat of a radioactive, ruined environment, forming an explosive equation that opens critical rifts in our own forsaken present. Resonating with the premise of The End of the World, the Korean's film, but all the more scary for its realness. The Radiance evacuated Japanese villages and untouchable plant life within the contamination zone served as an experimental laboratory in which elderly volunteers, who are called abandoned people by activists, willingly expose themselves to what the Audilith Group terms the necropolitics of radiation, meaning a governmentality of death administered by TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, in collusion with Japan's political elites and more broadly the global nuclear regime for scientific research, promoted by groups like the International Atomic Energy Agency. So just to clarify that, this is a still from the film that shows you an older man who is willingly exposing himself to the contamination, to the radiation within the contamination zone of Fukushima, because he believes, and he's been told, that the radiation won't affect him within his lifespan. So he expects maybe to live 20 more years. So he's willing to turn himself into a guinea pig so that scientists can learn more about the effect of radiation on human beings.
That's fact, not fiction.
That's fact, yeah, that's going on right now. So it's a kind of voluntary sacrifice. In the video, the abandoned landscape, eerily decorated with toxic flowers, is suffused with the creepy sounds of birds and insects heard in playgrounds and shopping streets normally filled with human activity. So I'll show you again a clip from the film. dangerous levels of radiation. So I apologize in advance, this part gets a little depressing. But then I try to end on at least a hopeful note. So these images and sounds are presented without explanatory voiceover, decontextualizing the shots from clear reference. It's difficult to know what we're looking at, in other words. And that invites conceptual speculation, leaving viewers to ask, maybe, at least some of you might have asked this, what do we make of a world suddenly evacuated of all humanity? One could surmise that, given the Autolith group's long-standing interest in the speculative realist philosophy, that the Radiant's post-human environment confronts the post-anthropocentric considerations of the theorist Ray Brassier, especially where he writes of, quote, a mind-independent reality, which despite the presumptions of human narcissism is indifferent to our existence and oblivious to the values and meanings which we would drape over it in order to make it more hospitable. Brassier's book, and that's a quote from his book called Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, from 2007, attempts to comprehend the logical consequences of the Enlightenment's disenchantment of the world through reason, and refuses to, in his words, to defend against the threat of nihilism by safeguarding the experience of meaning. So he's very interested in the condition, like thinking the conditions of meaninglessness. Rather than positioning nihilism as the heroic conquering of metaphysical thought, or as an act of empty negativity that represents a diminishment of the world's significance deprived of human values, as do philosophers like Nietzsche and Heidegger that he's very interested in. Brassier turns it into what he terms a speculative opportunity for philosophical inquiry into the meaning of thinking extinction when none will be around to think it. Yet it's striking that Brassier's text makes no ecological reference, even while Nihil Unbound was written at the time when some scientists are suggesting that we are currently living through the Earth's 6th mass species extinction event, which follows the last one, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, which occurred some 66 million years ago and wiped out 75% of all species, including the dinosaurs. Owing to a combination of climate change, environmental destruction, and the spread of human activity worldwide, we could see today the die-off of roughly half the world's plants, animals, and birds in the next 70 years. The journalist Elizabeth Kolbert just put out a book called Extinction that would be really, I think, relevant to look at in that context. So such an eventuality poses questions such as what a world would be like without its vibrant biodiversity, and ultimately, if that biodiversity is life-sustaining for humans, what would the world be like without us? And that's a reference to another book by Alan Weissman. Going beyond Brassier's reluctance or refusal to locate his extinction theory in current ecological terms, the Autolith group joins current-day global politics to an otherwise dehistoricized and depoliticized speculative realist philosophy. So speculative realism, this is a movement today that several people are practicing. People like Timothy Morton, Graham Harman, Ray Brassier, a number of other people as well. It's a very interesting development in philosophy right now. For instance, the Radiant film raises the ironic implications of the so-called Anthropocene. That is, that just as human beings come to be recognized as the current drivers of the Earth's geological epoch today, the Anthropocene, they are also potentially becoming agents of their own extinction. In addition to the Autolith group's film, we have further glimpses of post-human environments in contemporary art, where photography and video, thanks to their time-traveling capacity, cross and blur temporalities, uncovering hidden pockets of futurity in the present. As such, they seize that speculative opportunity of which Brassier speaks. I'm thinking particularly of the image complex surrounding post-nuclear disaster zones, such as Chernobyl and also Fukushima. Diana Thader's video installation, for example, Chernobyl from 2010, shows haunting images of Pripyat, the city built in the early 1970s for workers at the reactor in northwest Ukraine, now lying abandoned after the Chernobyl meltdown in 1986. It presents contemporary ruins in an architecture of sudden abandonment, the aftermath of disaster, where nature and animals, like horses, genetically altered in unknown ways by radiation exposure, reclaim formerly human spaces. And that's a fascinating element, I think, of some of these disaster zones, how they turn into effective nature sanctuaries. But at the same time, a kind of denatured or post-natural sanctuary. Thader's arena of video projection, so here's an image of the way her work appears in the gallery, presents a virtual theater of technological sensation and allegorizes a denaturalized nature emptied of human life. Or take the work of Jane and Louise Wilson, British artists, and their piece called The Toxic Camera from 2012, which is a video that investigates the Soviet filmmaker Vladimir Shevchenko's recordings of Chernobyl. And here you see a couple stills from his film. In the days after the accident, his piece called Chronicle of Difficult Weeks from 1986, for which he produced footage marked by static interference from radiation rendered visible via the visual obfuscations in his imagery. What the critic Susan Shupley calls an active radiological recording, whereby the radical imprint of disaster was inscribed directly into the emulsion of the film as decaying particles moved through the exterior casing of the movie camera. And indeed, his camera was so contaminated, it had to be buried on the outskirts of Kiev after he did this shoot. The work, and he died soon after also of exposure to radiation. The work relates to the uninhabitable space of nuclear contamination to the failure of the technologies of perception, a forlorn context which nonetheless can't suppress attempts at its visualization, even if that means tempting a contemporary death drive to know what the aftermath of human life looks like. The Radiant, in my view, goes still further, insofar as it entangles the future enchanted gardens of the post-human. And here's another still from The Radiant that shows you another kind of denaturalized nature. So it entangles the future enchanted gardens of the post-human in the political conflicts of the present, implicating us all in the necropolitics of radiation. In this sense, the video is appropriated footage of the now famous pointing man. There's the pointing man. This is again a still from the Radiant. This is the Fukushima worker who stood for 10 minutes pointing his finger at a security camera at the power plant, in the power plant just after its meltdown. That this passage, which is appropriated and replayed in the Radiant, can be read not simply as a protest act, one that was meant to articulate workers' rights claims against the TEPCO management, as the man later explained on his blog. So it was a protest against management for letting this happen and for subjecting workers to the conditions of radiation in the days during the cleanup. So if the video went viral on the internet in the days after the meltdown and received such reception in this work of contemporary art, in the Autolith Group's video, then I think it's because that resonant gesture unleashed an explosively charged index of the meeting point of the present and future, where the origins of the potential catastrophe of post-human extinction is seen to be firmly rooted in our own world, not in some sci-fi speculation. And furthermore, by including reference to Vito Acconci's video Centers from 1971, this is again, they include this footage in the Radiant. The Autolith Group recruits video art's so-called aesthetic of narcissism. This is a term of Rosalind Krauss's. They recruit video art's so-called aesthetic of narcissism and retools it as a defiant sign of popular accusation in a new media world of spectacular political gesture. So against the model of escapist fantasy, which is the worst case scenario, the film exemplifies what the theorist Frederick Jameson calls negative utopianism. One that, as he writes, transforms our own present into the determinate past of something yet to come. That's negative utopianism. Rather than giving itself over to the sci-fi seductions of some future biotechnology set in the final days of reckoning, this work, The Radiant, finds the future imminent in the specific conditions of the present. The result is that the future, intimated by The Radiant, works like a mechanism to make the present different than it appears, sparking the political energy to resist what is already occurring. That is, even as the video shows protesters contesting Japan's irresponsible and media-spun response to the disaster, especially when the government made the decision in cahoots with TEPCO to distribute, and this is fact, to distribute irradiated soil throughout the country from Fukushima, to shield itself against future liability lawsuits by destroying control groups of forensic samples, and valuing corporate profits over people by repeatedly raising the accepted risk levels of radiation exposure. And this is happening in the States as well. The Autolith Group thereby seizes the speculative opportunity of a post-extinction environment to reveal our own necropolitical regime. While it provides witness to a world without us, haunting in its calm and peacefulness, it also inspires the agency of political resistance. So finally, as we've seen, Documenta 13's concept-less exhibition tended more toward a dispersive bioaesthetics of sci-fi than political engagement, despite some very interesting works in the exhibition. As such, its curators missed the opportunity to address the philosophical and political controversies surrounding the status of life today, let alone position itself within them. Still, it remains significant as an exhibition project in that it opened paths for artists to explore the biopolitics of nature and the mixed economies of food production and experimental gardens, and the contested modes of environmental governance, present and future. These questions lie at the heart of contemporary debates over what kind of world we want to live in, while we can still live in it. and how it will be organized, and what role art might play in its creative imagination, representation, and realization. For with each passing day, the stakes of those debates only continue to grow more momentous. That's it. Thank you very much.